Most of us are familiar, perhaps mainly because of cartoonists, with the psychiatrist's couch. You know, you go and see the psychiatrist and you sit down and she says to you, I'm going to say a word and I want you to tell me the first word that comes into your mind. And she says, knife, and you say, fork, and she says, that's your trouble, you're too concerned about food. Well, here's my word, mission. Oh yes, I know what you mean by mission. There are missionaries who went out to foreign countries and they lived in tents and they did all kinds of strange things and they formed a kind of a church. Or in my background, mission. Yeah, our church was down a bit, not many people coming, so we decided to have a mission. And we invited a better preacher than you to come along for a week, and he preached sermons, and at the end of each sermon he made an altar call and people came down the front. I know what you mean by mission. Or perhaps you're more sophisticated and you're thinking in a larger term idea of it. Oh yes, I remember many, many years ago we had this fella from America. What was his name? Yeah, Billy Graham, that's right. He came out and he had a mission. And there were lots of people came to the showground and to the Sydney cricket ground. I know what you mean by a mission. Or perhaps you've just got a new CEO in your organisation. And what's the first thing he does? He pays a lot of money to a group of people who come in and they work you through for a day and you form a mission statement. Well, I know what you mean by mission. Well, one of the theologians wrote, the church exists by mission as fire exists by burning. And in his introduction to the Acts of the Apostle, J.B. Phillips has written, the growing tip of the church was out on the frontier where it faced the world and its needs. There were riots, arrests, imprisonment, but above all there was life. And I wonder when was the last time that we had riots and arrests and imprisonment in Toorak Uniting Church. Now, the Gospels give us a selection of the things that Jesus did and said, and it begins with his call, as we heard last week, his call to disciples to follow him, and it ends with the words that were read to us this morning, as the Father has sent me, so send I you. And so those of you with a cryptic mind have worked out, when you looked at the title of the sermon this morning, believe, be, do. Well, that's the mission of the church. It's a three-legged stool. And so I thought that it would be a good idea to spend the next hour or so thinking about three Greek words that illustrate the mission of the church. Believe. We think it was a baptismal confession, but in Romans, Paul says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and if you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, then you will be saved. And in the letter to the Corinthians, Paul talks about the preaching. Now, I'm not quite sure who he had in mind when he wrote, it pleased God by the foolishness of preaching. We could give Paul a bit of a lesson here, or the translators a bit of a lesson here, because what he actually meant was the foolishness of what we preach. For many people, what we preach seems to be foolish. There's a lovely, I suppose, kind of painting discovered on the walls of a very old building in Rome, where there is a man kneeling down, and in front of him on the wall is a drawing of a donkey. And the caption is, "Alexandros worships his God." The foolishness of what we preach. And so for me, I move to the words of H.H. Butterfield, who wrote, "Hold fast to Christ, and for the rest be totally uncommitted." In this church, during the normal year, on Tuesday night we have a discussion group, and we talk about the sermon from the week before. There's just one thing to be aware of there, because in discussion groups you can get shared ignorance. We try not to do that. We try to let people speak about what the passage from the Bible has meant to them. In a previous church, there was a young man who started to come to the services on Sunday. No great religious beliefs, but his girlfriend was coming to the church. So what better way to impress her than to come to church with her? And after a couple of months, he asked, could he see me? And he said to me, I had absolutely no idea of what you were talking about. You talked about Moses. I didn't know who Moses was. You talked about Adam and Eve. Well, I had a vague idea what that was about, but nothing much more. And I can't believe that he didn't leave at that stage. But what he did was to go out and buy a series of golden books for children. And he educated himself over the years by reading those stories and learning about the Bible. And it was one of my great joys that I was able to baptise him one day and receive him into the membership of the church. Not many people would have been that seeking, but he was. And so there's something to believe. You will advance in your understanding of the gospel as you study it. The second word is koinonia, and it means fellowship. I spent a lot of time when I was at City Mission speaking at service clubs. And quite often the invitation would be this: the meeting starts at 7 o'clock, preceded by fellowship at 6:30. You can imagine what the fellowship was. And one of the downsides of COVID has been the isolation that many of us have felt. We've not been able to meet as a fellowship. And the fellowship that the New Testament talks about is a fellowship that transforms human relationships. There may be differences, please God there are, but no distinctions. Let me just tell you a story about something that illustrated this for me. In a previous church, we were having a communion service one Sunday night, and for no reason at all other than it seemed like a good idea, we decided within that service we would pass the peace. You turned to the person next to you and you said, "The peace of God be with you," and they said, "And with you." As I looked into that congregation, there were two men sitting next to each other. One was a man who'd been a high-ranking officer in the army and had been the mayor of Burnie. Alongside him was a man who had just come out of jail after being in for 5 years. And as I looked at that, I saw one say to the other, "The peace of God be with you," and the other reply, "And with you." And it seemed to me that that summed up the message of the gospel. This is what fellowship is about. It is having a belief in God and Jesus Christ. And you can't love the person you've seen. If you can't love the person you've seen, how can you love God whom you haven't seen? That's one of the great privileges of being at Toorak, the ecumenical group that meets regularly and where we share our understanding of the gospel. You see, when I think of ecumenism, I don't think that we say to, for example, we say to the Anglicans, if you'll give up your bishops, we'll give up our, what do we do that's strange? I don't know. We'll give up our consensus, that's right. We don't say to the Baptists, if you'll give up your baptism by immersion, then we'll give up our whatever else. We learn from each other. And within the fellowship of the Christian church, we learn from each other. And the final word is the word diaconia. Now, literally, it means through the dust. And that suggests to me that if we are to do something, it may mean getting our hands dirty. I don't know what it will mean for this church, what it will mean for me, what it will mean for you. But Albert Schweitzer spoke about the fellowship of those who bear the mark of pain. I think we can sum this all up in words that Schweitzer wrote, speaking about his time in Africa. The operation is over, and in the dimly lit dormitory, I wait for the sick man's recovery. Scarcely has he recovered when he stares about and cries again and again, "I've no more pain. I've no more pain." His hand feels for mine and will not let it go. And then I begin to tell him and the others in the room, it is the Lord Jesus who has told the doctor and his wife to come to Africa. To tell them that people in Europe gave the money so that they could live here and cure the sick. And then I have to answer all kinds of questions as to who these Europeans are and where they live and how they know the Africans suffer. The African sun is shining through the coffee bushes into the dark shed, but we, black and white, we sit side by side and feel we know by experience the meaning of the words, and you are all sisters and brothers. Believe, be, do. Amen.